Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And it's a pleasure to have our different groups this summer join together and to learn with each other and to see each other. And from my perspective, it's a great feeling to feel the vitality of the Jewish people and the vitality of what's happening this summer here at the Institute. My theme tonight is entitled National Identity in the Public Sphere and the Public Space. See, the conflict is escalating. Things are getting more dangerous and difficult. And for once, someone could make this statement, and I'm not talking about Iran. I'm not talking about more centrifuges. And I'm not talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or about Egypt, or about Hamas, or about the Islamicization of the Arab world. We'll talk about those. But tonight, I want to talk about an escalation of a conflict of a different type. It's becoming more at the forefront of Israeli society. The conflict and the struggle over what type of country do we want to have and what type of country do we want to be. What does the code word, the homeland of the Jewish people, mean and obligate? What is a national homeland? What is a Jewish and democratic state? And the example that's literally out of today's newspaper and which has dividing Israeli society over the last, in some sense, years, but it's just sort of quieted over the last few months. The issue of the way the ultra-Orthodox community serves and integrates into the society vis-a-vis its service in the military is but a test and a model and an example of something much bigger, which I want to explain because it's a different type of conflict. There's a different issue on the table today. To be a sovereign state means to control a particular space to the exclusion of all others. And when you have a right, when every national group has a right to sovereignty, what it means is you have a right to have your place in which your values, your principles, your ideologies define a particular space. Now, other people may be here, but they are here as a minority, not as a national group, capable and allowed to shape from their perspective the national identity of the state. You're sovereign. And that's what being a minority means. You're a minority within somebody else's sovereignty. To the exclusion of all others. But here now comes the fundamental challenge, not just of Israel, but of many, many, many modern states. What happens when we have others within? What happens when the mythic notion that a society or a community of meaning which bonds together around some shared ideology finds itself with members who don't agree with each other as to what those principles are? They don't agree as to what we share. They don't agree about the public sphere. You see, in reality, we don't create communities. We inherit them. We wake up one day and we find other people with us and we find ourselves, we are a we, and I don't know what's we about us. But we're a we. And we could be ethnic, and that only takes you so far. We could be historical, and that also takes you only so far. But we is very rarely cultural, ideological, principle. We disagree. And even if once, not only do we inherit people who are different from us, we also change. And our societies change. And certain beliefs which were more dormant all of a sudden become more dominant. Lines that were not so important become very, very important. And all of a sudden, what does it mean to be a sovereign entity to the exclusion of all others when the fundamental challenge you face is, who am I? I know sometimes who the other is. There is an other. But what happens when that line is not so clear? And part of the challenge facing Israel and ultra-Orthodoxy is that in the past, the ultra-Orthodox were truly another. And there was a profound, profound rejection of ultra-Orthodox in Israeli society. A deep, deep rejection. Giving them rights under the assumption that ototot, that's a technical term, soon, ototot, just about, they're going to disappear. And so I allow you something, but you're not someone who I really have to see. You're someone who I have to tolerate in the most negative sense. I just tolerate your existence until soon you'll disappear. Now what happens when you find that that other is not outside, but is inside, is in your government? What happens when it's not so clear who you are? Now one of the great myths of many individuals who live in North America when they come to Israel is, just learn from us. Do you remember when you said that? Do you remember the time when it was so self-evident to you that the solution to the problem of Israel in public spaces, just how do we make Israel a little more like you? Oh, if you just had our constitution. Oh, if you just had our form of government. What a joke. When I want to feel good about Israel, I travel to the United States. I feel so good. When I want to talk about what should be a culture of discussion in Israel, I just turn on News in America. And I say, this is who I don't want to be. I leave the United States embarrassed very often. I leave embarrassed nationally. I also leave very often embarrassed in the Jewish community, which for some reason is also assimilating this. We're assimilating a lot of principles of North American life. We're also assimilating a culture of discussion, which is frankly nothing less than vulgar. Vulgar. But we all face this problem. Who are we? But more significantly, how do I live with a we which is so profoundly different from each other? This is a problem in Israel, but it's a problem in every society. Now, one way of trying to mitigate some of the differences is to say certain issues are off the table. We don't agree about so many things, but could we at least just, this one we all agree we're not going to talk about. So you could have a constitutional amendment first, saying, you know what? Religion we're not going to talk about. Doesn't have to be a we when it comes to religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the rights of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress or grievances. Let's just take that stuff off, and then at least we'll deal with other things. But let's keep religion out, because that's something that we really can't bridge. But that notion of the First Amendment is really within the United States context. Goes, as I said this morning, way beyond or different than the distinction between state and religion to a core distinction, which Jefferson speaks of. And that is the notion of to build a wall of separation between church and state. Let's just separate them. All stuff that belongs in church, keep it in church. And we'll disagree about the other things, but the stuff, let's not get into each other's churches. Let's not tell each other what, at least if you have your church and I have my church, we can at least have a public sphere in which we don't have to bring all of our stuff, because some of your stuff and some of your difference finds expression in my church. It's not here. And so, for example, you want to have a mechitza between men and women? Knock yourself out. You like it? Perfect. That's just fine. Where? In church. Not where? On a bus. And so the purpose of a separation of church and state would be to make life easier. Let's just keep those things. Let's not, when you try to bring your things, just keep it over there. And then we could be an us. Because we don't have to be an us in church or synagogue. There we have our denominations and our different stuff. Together, we have another agenda. Now, one of the things that you all know now is that when you come to think about Israel, you're not thinking about something that is inherently problematic because of the nature of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. What you all know now, or in a minute will know, is that this is a problem that we all face. Because the distinction between church and state and religion and state is not so simple. And it's not so clear how it's supposed to work, even when you have a constitution. And again, as I said this morning, if I believe that creation is a counter-truth, am I violating church and state? Am I violating an individual's First Amendment rights? Or actually, quite to the contrary, am I violating your First Amendment rights when I'm not giving you an option to learn creationism? Am I turning evolution into a religion? Am I inhibiting your ability to freely express your religious beliefs? And even more so, who said, what is religion? Is religion only about church? Is religion only about the pews? Or is religion about ideas and values which by definition transcend, break out of the church? No church could confine a religious tradition which is filled with ideas and values and principles, let alone, for sure, notions of truth and science. It's part of what religion does. It's part of religion's power, because religion is not about silly little things. Religion is about ultimate issues, trying to guide your total perspective on life. And what am I supposed to do? Only leave those ultimate issues to bear when I come into my church or synagogue, and when I go outside say, whoops, I switched the switch? I shut them off? When I have to think about a question of what constitutes a marriage, am I violating First Amendment principles or the wall between church and state when I say that a gay or lesbian couple cannot be a marriage because a marriage is between men and women as taught by my tradition? Now, is that statement a violation of church and state? Is it a violation of church and state when I say that a fetus is murder? Killing a fetus is murder. Where did I learn it from? Oh, excuse me, you learned that from Scripture, therefore you have to shut up on this question. If I learned it from my intuitive moral instincts, oh, then you can bring it into the public sphere. Everything about the United States conversation today is a conversation about the struggle and difficulty and the lack of simplicity of the clear distinctions attempted to be created by First Amendment and by the wall but separation of church and state. It's not working. And in many ways, it can't work. It could only work when you are not committed or when you feel disempowered or in the minority. The minority is always very careful to bring their positions into the public sphere, because they know that if what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if I bring my Jewish principles in, I'm going to get hopped over the head with somebody else's, and I'm a minority, and therefore I try to keep things neutral. What happens, however, when a group begins to look to the left and to the right, and then again to the left and again to the right, and sees that it's not such a small group of people, and realizes that a silence that it has accepted upon itself in order to preserve its own integrity, that a silence that it has accepted upon itself in order to ensure that the state doesn't enter into its space, all of a sudden realizes, I don't have to be worried. I could actually enter into your space. There's 70 million of me. I could actually determine the future elections, even without an AIPAC. I don't even need a political action committee because I am that big. And state after state, you know, I don't have to campaign. You know that if you want to get elected, you better speak to me. And you better be very careful what you say. Because I want to hear a candidate who speaks about religion and values. And with your wall and separation, could an atheist ever win in the United States? Or could, for example, President Obama, I think, David, it was you who told me this, could President Obama defend himself against the notion that he has been influenced by Reverend Wright by arguing, I never went to church. I didn't go that often. Could I say, I just, no. I'm against taxes, and I'm there all the time. There's like certain givens. So what we all see, and what I ask of you now, as you think about Israel, and as you're going to go back and talk about Israel, when Israel is this strange reality so completely different than anything that you experience, and as a result something corely alienating, and how do we fix it? The first part of re-engaging a conversation with Israel is that this issue is no different. We all, and I'm not even going to Europe because that's not my purpose now to go through every country in the world. Let's just take ours. How do multicultural, multi-ideological societies build a shared public space with each other when we have different ideologies and beliefs? Now in Israel, very often on the issue of state and religion, it was very complicated. Because all too often, you had one group which was ideological and another group which didn't really care. And compromises on issues of conversion or of marriage weren't about two different groups trying to engage counter ideologies about the public sphere. It was about one group which had a clear ideology about religion in the public sphere, and the other one which didn't care that much as long as it didn't bother them too much and as long as they got a political payback for something else. And if I cared about this, I'm not fighting. As I said to many of you, you want me to fight about the issue of women at the wall? I don't go to the wall. Frankly, I don't know why you're going there either. It's theirs. It's somebody else's. It's not my issue. And so Israel was able to navigate many of the issues of so-called public sphere. Because you didn't have two counter groups arguing and asking, what's at stake? The price was manageable. Didn't bother me that much. And so if you cared more and I cared less, go for it. Especially if you'll go for it and give me something in return. Especially in an area that I really care about, like foreign policy or economics. What makes the issue of the drafting of ultra-Orthodox and a number of the other issues that have risen in Israeli society recently is that you feel there is now two counter ideologies. Serving in the army in Israel is not an issue of equal burden of the public responsibilities. That's not the issue. The issue is not equal burden, equal responsibility. It's not. That's just what it says. And those who say it, that's my job, don't even understand what they're saying. It's that service in the army is a religion in Israel. It's what it means to be the new Jew of Israel. It's the core of what it means to be a Jewish Zionist. And that is to take responsibility for your existence. To take control of it. It's this new Jew who is empowered to shape the world. To give up the fate that defined the pre-Zionist Jew. And to become like all other modern human beings, people of choice, and by that I grab the choice and I take responsibility for it. And when the non-Haredi Jew looks at the Haredi, they don't see on the issue of service somebody who is more observant than them. Someone who is more like a Judaism that they may not be in, but that they could respect. On this, they see something which is Jewishly inferior to them. And we have two counter ideologies. One which sees Talmud Torah keneged kulam. The study of Torah surpasses them all. And it's taken literally. And in the ultra-Orthodox community, it's not an anti-Zionist ideology. It's an ideology which says if the study of Torah surpasses them all, that means the future survival of the Jewish people is dependent more on how many students we have in yeshiva than how many people we have in a tank unit. And do you really believe that? And the answer is absolutely. Absolutely. The future of the Jewish people is dependent on this group. That is one belief. And the other belief is that the future of the Jewish people is dependent on a new Judaism. On v'chai behem. You shall live by them. And you shall live by them surpasses them all. And to live and to take responsibility to live and to build a Torah of life in that sense. A Torah which is integrated in life. A Torah which involves responsibility for your financial welfare and for your security well-being is what Torah is about. So what we have here are two counter visions of not merely the public sphere, of our Jewish identity. And in many ways, Netanyahu is 100% right. This is not, I'm going to come back to this. This is not something that you're going to coerce one group to take the other position. Not going to be. It's just not going to happen. You could write any sanctions you want. There aren't enough jails to put those who disagree with one ideology away. We're going to have to find a different way, a different methodology. We're going to have to use a different system. And it's not about political coercion, and it's not about threats, and it's not about punishment. There are two counter ideologies in our sovereign state. There are two counter ideologies. Not about conversion or marriage. About what place a woman has in our society. Oh, you want me to marry by a rabbi? Okay, I'll marry by a rabbi. It doesn't bother me. And I might even like it a little bit. I might even like it a lot. I might be perfectly comfortable with it. As 55% at least of Israelis are. Vast majority. Perfectly comfortable with rabbinate marriages exclusively. Orthodox rabbinate marriages. And those who aren't perfectly comfortable, a very large number of them, aren't bothered. And of those who aren't bothered, there's even another large minority who say, I don't want to get married by any rabbi. And then there's some who are looking for another alternative. But it's still a smaller minority. Even if it's 25%, it's a smaller minority, and God willing it'll grow, but that's where it is now. But when you're talking about what place does a woman have in our society, all of us have a religion on this issue. It's not religious versus secular. It's two counter visions of what it means to be a Jew in the modern world. Do I want to live in a Jewish democratic state where women are in the back of the bus? It's exciting a passion which is different. And you have to understand these issues are more complicated than many of the issues that we had to deal in the past. Much more akin to issues about family that you're addressing in the United States and Canada. Or when we ask, can an army unit survive with soldiers who believe that because of religious ideology, they can get up and leave a military event? This is not, I don't care, you care. What does it mean? Don't we need one place where we are all committed to one system of rules which we can count on? What happens, however, when we have military units in which some people say, excuse me, that I can't do. And I'm allowed to get up and leave if I can't do that. Not an ultra-Orthodox, does a religious Zionist soldier have a right to say, I don't listen to women singing. It's not part of the laws of modesty as I understand them. I don't want to participate in that. And you want me in the army, how could you coerce me to violate my principles of faith? And another ideology says, women's voices and equal service of women is a principle of our army. The conflict is more complicated because it's getting more and more ideological. It's almost as ideological as it was at the founding of the state, but then the counter voices were tolerated because everybody thought they would go away. Now, without doubt, over the years, we reach different peaks. We're at another peak. We're at a deeply, profoundly ideological peak. And how do we think about this question? And what I'd like to do is to offer, not a solution, some principles that I believe ought to be brought to bear when you are making up your opinion, when you're thinking about these questions. When you're thinking about segregated or separated or modest buses. When you're talking about how men and women will serve in the military. When you talk about issues of equal service in the army. It will also have implications on issues that are not yet central in Israeli society, such as issues of conversion and marriage. And it also bears, very interesting, on an issue that's been resolved in Israeli society in a fascinating way, and that is gay pride parades, including in Jerusalem. What are some of these principles? Let's walk together. And in walking together, I don't want to study Talmud. In walking together today, I want to study some United States and Israeli Supreme Court cases. And read selectively. You could choose to follow inside, or you could choose just because I'm going to skip around. But the cases are before you. Minersville School District in 1940. 2 Jehovah's Witness school children suspended from school in Minersville, Pennsylvania, because they refused to salute the American flag during mandatory morning exercises. Parents alleged that their children's due process rights, in particular their First Amendment rights, had been violated by the school and sued. As a Jehovah's Witness, I don't salute flags. I don't. Flags are never, I can't allow anything to be so significant that it in any way will diminish the centrality and significance and centrality of God in my life. I don't salute. I don't bow my head. Mordechai could feel comfortable, you know. Remember Mordechai? I don't bow. I'm not a Bauer. Felix Frankfurter, the Jewish ticket on the Supreme Court, writes the majority opinion and justifies the banishment of the children from the school. Conscientious scruples have not, in the course of the long struggle for religious toleration, relieved the individual from obedience to a general law not aimed at the promotion or restriction of religious belief. As a country, we can't regulate religion, but a law which affects religion is not a violation of First Amendment freedom. The mere possession of religious convictions which contradict the relevant concerns of a political society does not relieve the citizen from the discharge of political responsibilities. National unity is a basis of national security. The ultimate foundation of a free society is the binding tie of cohesive sentiment. Such a sentiment is fostered by all those agencies of the mind and spirit which may serve to gather up the traditions of a people. We live by these symbols. The flag is our symbol of national unity, transcending all internal differences, however large, within the framework of the Constitution. You have to salute, and in so doing, Justice Frankfurter is worried about what could be called the tyranny of the minority. The ability of the minority to undermine, either because of political connections or by hiding behind a constitutional right, to allow them to undermine a society from advocating for its core issues. There is a majority. The core foundational principle of a democracy is the rule of the majority. Let the majority rule. And a minority cannot hinder the ability of the majority to define the public sphere for themselves. They have that right. And as long as the majority is not promulgating a particular religion, the fact that it affects religion is not sufficient grounds for a minority to not enable the majority to develop its culture. You're sovereign to the exclusion of all others. Sovereignty, as expressed by the rule of the majority, is a key principle of the rights of a society and its duties. And individual liberties or individual freedoms have to be limited. 3 years later, the Supreme Court overturns this ruling. And in essence, what it argues, and here Robert Jackson argues, in essence, that a few people not saluting the flag doesn't undermine our collective identity. Assuming that if it did, maybe I would have a different answer. Beautifully stated on page 2, 5 lines from the top, 4 lines. To believe that patriotism will not flourish if patriotic ceremonies are voluntary and spontaneous instead of a compulsory routine is to make an unflattering estimate of the appeal of our institutions to free minds. It's like every time I read this, it's like, makes my day. What a beautiful, this is just phenomenal. This is just phenomenal. What a great mind. And you read it and you say, God bless America. Don't you? It's like, wow. But you're not destroying. What he's actually arguing is to the contrary. But freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom. The test of its substance is the right to differ as to things that touch the heart of the existing order. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by words or acts of faith therein. And if there's an exception, they don't occur to us right now. The core of America is actually enhanced by this, not threatened by this. And a majority which worries about the tyranny of the minority has to work much harder than two little students, whether you're going to salute the flag in Minersville or ich weiß nicht where. The collective existence, the rule of the majority, has to be severely curtailed and worry about the fundamental rights of a minority as well to express their ideology. Frankfurter, however, still disagrees. And in a minority opinion, he writes, the constitutional protection of religious freedom terminated disabilities. It did not create new privileges. It gave religious equality, not civil immunity. Its essence is freedom from conformity to religious dogma, not freedom from conformity to law because of religious dogma. You hear the Talmudic pilpul. You're free from religious coercion. You're not free from participating in the national shared identity. And he refuses to accept, even though the court case, the majority rules against it. But when it comes to the military, here, there wasn't a problem. And in the case of Goldman versus Weinberger, whether an Orthodox individual in the Air Force is allowed to wear his yarmulke inside, when Air Force regulation dictates that the only individuals who can have something on their head are military police inside a room, in the service, in active duty. And they argue, like all army units argue, what? We need it for cohesion. And the Supreme Court says, you know what? We have very clear principles of First Amendment, but when it comes to the Army, First Amendment doesn't rule in the same way that it rules in civilian life, and we have to bow and acquiesce to the military's notion of what it needs for its national collective cohesion. And therefore they rule that he can't wear his yarmulke. However, in a minority opinion, I think it's Justice Brennan, but it's not mentioned here, I apologize. He says, if Dr. Goldman wanted to wear a hat to keep his head warm, or to cover a bald spot, I'd join the majority. Mere personal preference and dress are not constitutionally protected. The First Amendment, however, restrains the government's ability to prevent an Orthodox Jewish serviceman from or punish him for wearing a yarmulke. I find totally implausible the suggestion that the overarching group identity of the Air Force would be threatened if Orthodox Jews were allowed to wear yarmulkes with their uniforms. Quite to the contrary. A yarmulke worn with the United States military uniform is an eloquent reminder that the shared and proud identity of the United States serviceman embraces and unites religious and ethnic pluralism. And so goes the debate. And the history and the story of democracies, of liberal democracies, is about this back and forth, about cases being judged and overturned. One generation's minority opinion is the next generation's majority opinion, because they both echo a core principle, which the minute you leave one, there's something that you're losing. A minority, a democracy, is only a democracy to the extent that the majority's voice is defined as having its own inalienable rights, and that its voice is what constitutes the cacophony of depth and identity, which is what defines the majority. And you have that place, and I want you to have that place. But at the same time, when is it that a minority makes the public space one that's alien to the majority? When is it that group cohesion or other ideologies, if you have your rights, what would happen to mine? Could Jews have ever won a fight against having Christmas trees in public spaces? Could they have ever, what would have happened if we even tried? And we did. We tried with creches. We made distinctions. But what happens if we said to America, what is this tree? No Christmas. What would have happened if the minority would have become the Scrooges of American society? What about my rights? That my values, my ideals, my sense of the public space, I need my space too. And if you cause me to be alienated from my sense of space, then that's not a democracy either. It's a dance. And now let's take this dance to two cases of the Israeli Supreme Court. Case number one, Bar Ilan Road. A neighborhood predominantly Orthodox, predominantly ultra-Orthodox. In the reconstitution of Jerusalem's neighborhoods, a major thoroughfare of access to the northern neighborhoods passes next to or passes on Bar Ilan Street. Are you allowed to drive there on Shabbat? What do you think about? Are you allowed to drive on Shabbat, or, as was ultimately decided, is the road closed for external traffic on Shabbat during services? Accommodations are made for the 3 non-Orthodox people who lived in the neighborhood. And security and ambulances are allowed to have complete access. This was what was determined by a commission, and it comes to the Supreme Court. Some secular members in the community say you're violating my right, a right accepted by Israel, especially after 1992, when we passed the basic law of human dignity, chakol adam, and freedom. And one of those freedom is freedom of travel, a core right. You're not letting me have access to my home. You're causing me undue hardship. Or is the sensitivity of the ultra-Orthodox Jews who live in the neighborhood to live a Shabbat that they want, what's dominant? How do we create a public sphere? What interests me is not the ruling, even when we'll come to it, is some of the issues that are put on the table, and it's issues that should guide us as we think about some of our issues and struggles. First, in a fascinating ruling, Aaron Barak argues on page 4, as a general interpretive guideline, subject to specific legislative provisions, it may be said that considerations that take religious sensibilities into account are precluded if religious coercion is the final goal of such consideration. In contrast, religious sensibilities may be taken into account if they are intended to give expression to religious needs. Indeed, religious coercion is said to run counter to the right to freedom of religion and human dignity, but consideration of religious needs is, however, consistent with freedom of religion and human dignity. Religious sensibilities, the Supreme Court decides, are a valid consideration. When I look at my public sphere, Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, individuals' religious sensibilities are important. And I have to answer to them. Now, I can't answer to them if your religious sensibilities are coercive to my religious ideology. But not every acquiescence to your religious sensibilities violates my religious freedom. It might violate my ability to travel, but it doesn't violate my religious freedom. We, as a Jewish state, are obligated to be sensitive to religious freedoms, the Supreme Court here decides, to religious sensitivities and sensibilities. And they argue tolerance must not give license to offend the religious sensibilities of the other. We're in one society together. It can be said that the serious violation of religious feelings is the antithesis of tolerance. And he's turning to secular, this is a secular court, turning to the secular individuals who brought the court case and said, you have an obligation to tolerance also. You have inalienable rights, but tolerance is a requirement for all of us. For tolerance is intended to nurture and promote freedom of expression. And that's what this religious freedom is about. And listen to this nuance. And so it is possible to infringe human rights for the purpose of protecting feelings. This is as Jewish a country and a Jewish a ruling as you could ever find. How are you feeling? It's like manishma. It's like manishma. And I'm obligated by the answer you give to me to manishma. What a definition of a shared public space, of national cohesion. Not just determined by principles alone, but determined by national cohesion is served when I don't want to hurt the way you feel. Now, how do I balance not hurting the way you feel and inalienable rights? Look what they say. And so it is possible to infringe human rights for the purpose of protecting feelings, particularly religious feelings and lifestyles, in a society with democratic values, provided that the harm exceeds the threshold of tolerance accepted in that society. That the harm to the individual's feelings are so great that it passes a core threshold. Now, where is that threshold? What's the objective place for that threshold? Give me a constitutional ruling, and all of you should already know that there is no constitutional condom that's going to protect you and make all such questions safe. Quite naturally, the threshold of tolerance varies from one democratic society to the next. This being the case, while it is possible to learn from the experiences of other democracies, the utility of such comparisons is actually quite limited. Thus, for instance, the stricter the separation between religion and state under a given system, the more that the rights are set out in more absolute terms, the more likely that such a system will prefer human rights to human feelings. Conversely, the more permeable the boundaries between religion and state, like in a Jewish democratic state, the more our legal culture is predicated on a relative conception of human rights. Greater significance will attach to feelings as a proper ground for limited human rights. Our society is unique. Consequently, the solution we must seek are undoubtedly equally unique, or Israeli style. The ultra-Orthodox aren't my enemy. They're my citizen. And when I rule, I have to hear, are their feelings being hurt? Now, their feelings aren't relevant if it's causing religious coercion. And therefore, ultimately, what the Supreme Court decides, and they want to make sure there's a number of criteria. For example, they say, the harm caused, however, this is the follow, look at this. The harm caused to the secular members of the public, or rather, to summarize beforehand, considerations of feeling, including religious sensibilities, are proper grounds for infringing on human rights, but under the following conditions. First, taking feelings into account conforms with the specific objective underlining the legislation, that I'm actually doing it because I really assess that the issue here is a profound feeling. And in this ruling, there's a whole extolling of the centrality of Shabbos to the Jewish culture and the feeling of an individual who's now living in accordance with Shabbat and their needs to feel that Shabbat in the public sphere. So they deal, yes, this is a real need, and it's their need that I'm actually coming to address. Secondly, it is permitted to take religious feelings into account only if doing so does not involve religious coercion. Your feeling can't require me, like if you feel bad about me eating chametz on Pesach, that's not my problem. You don't get to feel bad, or you could, but the court doesn't regulate or take into account your feeling bad when at issue is my religious freedom. And thus, for example, if someone would argue on a parallel, I feel bad if you get married in a non-Orthodox marriage, the principles here would apply and they're self-evident. I could accept that you're feeling bad, but you're feeling bad that in the Jewish state there's people getting married in the way that they shouldn't be getting married. I appreciate that you feel bad, but you don't get, or I don't take into account your bad feelings if your bad feelings are stopping me from expressing my religious freedoms. And third, religious freedoms may only be considered when the harm to those is so severe that it's said to exceed the proper threshold of tolerance. And the court therefore decides as follows. When it comes to the individuals who wanted to use Bar Ilan Road in order to get to Ramot, and there is an alternative road which is 1.2 kilometer detour, they decided that the threshold of the harm to the feelings of the ultra-Orthodox citizens of Bar Ilan exceed the right of the individual not to travel 1.2 kilometers on a bypass road on Shabbat. Only, however, when the feelings that you have are extremely strong. And that's when you're outside of your home and going to shul and coming back to shul. When you're in your house eating, the mere fact that I'm riding on a car bothering your feelings aren't being heard enough. And therefore, it is only when, during certain times of the day, that this bypass road, this road will be closed to outside traffic. And the Supreme Court, however, is profoundly bothered by the serious harm that is being caused to the non-Orthodox members of the society, of that neighborhood, and leaves it, and as a result refuses to close the street until, and it says to the transport ministry, find a fair and equitable solution. You can't lock these people out of their homes. That you can't do. And thus it tries to find a way to balance, and for both of us to live with each other and to ask, yes, sometimes your rights, it's not such a huge right, and my feelings might be greater, and sometimes it's not. Final case, and is often the case, it's a small little law. Little details. Rabbinic court in Rishon LeZion decides that they're overseeing the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society in Rehovot. They decide that from now on, nobody's allowed to use the Gregorian calendar or Latin letters on their tombstones. Only Hebrew letters in the Hebrew calendar. It happened beforehand, but no more. And one of the reasons for this is that prior to this ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that the freedom, that the right of individuals to dignity and freedom requires the state to provide throughout the country an alternative form of non-Jewish legal burial. We have secular burials as mandated by the state, which means that as an individual, the Social Security pays for your burial and you have a right to have a burial the way you want to have your burial. And the court has to set up these throughout the country so that a person doesn't have to travel too far. New law. Now, what does that mean, however, if you have an alternative to go to a non-Jewish burial, in that a burial of Jews, but one not governed by Orthodox law? Now, when the Orthodox rabbinate says you don't have a right to bury your dead the way you want to, does that constitute a violation of your core rights when you could go to the other cemetery? You have another alternative. Let me run this the way I want to run it. And now that you have another space, isn't this a perfect, how do we share the public sphere? Everybody has their own space. The court decides fascinatingly and says, yes, everybody does have their own space. However, no government agency, no matter who they are, could ever violate the fundamental right of freedom and dignity. And you have a right to write on your beloved tombstone what it is that you want to write. And the reality of new courts, of new cemeteries, wasn't meant or doesn't serve as an exemption from following the core principle of human dignity and freedom, which has to apply throughout the land. Remarkable. And it states as follows. I can find, in the paragraph before the end, I can find no good reason to impose the ruling of the local rabbinic authority on those who are religiously observant and those who are non-religious, as if the laws of the state, as if it were, i.e. religion, were the laws of the state. Thus we can in no way accept the behavior of the rabbi of the Jewish Burial Society who tried to impose his decision on the entire community, on the religiously observant and on the non-religious. The more we contemplate such an imposition, the more we are shocked. And notice, by the way, the grounds for this are, once this is in our Supreme Court, the next legislation has nothing to do with people who are being buried, but it has to be people who also has to do with what? People are alive. This principle actually has radical ramifications for the rest of Israeli society, and I believe it's going to come. But at the same time, he says, look at this, it's such beauty. However, while I tell you this, a neighbor should always be careful to be a good neighbor, one who does not do things that will harm his or her neighbor. Thus, for example, a cross should not be carved on a Jewish grave, since a cross can harm to an intolerable degree the dignity of the dead neighbor and the feelings of his or her family. Just as a good neighbor does not make too much noise or create bad smells, the same principle should hold true in a cemetery. I am at loss, however, to understand how the writing of a name in foreign letters, the letters the deceased lived by, will harm his or her neighbor. Didn't that neighbor see foreign writings in his or her lifetime? Why would it harm him after death? Isn't it? It's like, this is just beautiful. But here you see, but he's saying, it's not that I'm ignoring other sensibilities. I just think in this case, who has to give in? And your dignity to stand and to be with the one whom you buried, the one whom you lost, in a way that to call him by the name or her by the name that's what's bothering you? Across, so I can understand there might be limits. A neighbor has to be a good neighbor. Interestingly enough, Chief Justice Englert dissents. And he argues something that is very, very indicative of the way much of the public discourse in Israel on these issues is conducted. He said, "Be that as it may, I am of the opinion that in the matter at hand, the right of the relatives of the deceased to carve the gravestones as they like must retreat in the face of the right of the Jewish Burial Society to act in accordance with the local rabbinic authority ruling." It's how is he presenting it? It's two opposite rights. I'm a religious Orthodox Jew. I got a ruling from the rabbinic court. You can violate my right to live in accordance with Judaism as I know it. Why is this so? The Jewish Burial Society, as its name revealed, is holy. It's an institution performing a religious function that is known in the Jewish tradition as true kindness. The Jewish Burial Society must act according to Jewish law as ruled by the local rabbinic authority. This takes precedence, and he says the Supreme Court can't decide what Jewish law is. You can say it's important, not important. That's for them to decide. That's their religious freedom. They have a freedom as a minority to do so. In my opinion, this court is not authorized to force a religious body, be it public or private, to act in contravention to Jewish law. And as a result, whenever you have a religious authority in control of any government or any national issues, they are governed solely by their definition of religion, and that's according to England, their religious right. And you as an individual, you could decide to go to Cyprus. You can't tell the rabbinate what to do. You can't tell the rabbinate to accept Reform and conservative rabbis. The government, you want to fund them? Fund them. Take the money out of the budget of the culture minister. Don't take it out of the budget of the religious minister, as is the case. And so now you have different religious people whose rights take precedence. How do we balance sensitivity of feelings, core basic rights? What's more important? Are your feelings being hurt more than my rights being taken or not? Does the state have a right to tell the religious what to do, or is that a violation of their freedom of religion? United States conversation and an Israeli conversation. Both very complementary. Both recognizing that a public sphere is a dance. It's not about winning. Because if you win and the minority doesn't have its voice, you're not you. It's not you. And if you win and somebody's feelings are hurt, that's not the type of country I want to live in. So what do we do? How do we think about some of these questions? I want to tell you what the army did with the issue of equal service between men and women and the ability of religious and non-religious to live together. And then I want to end with some just brief observations about how we might want to think about the issue of separate buses, and ultimately also the drafting of ultra-Orthodox into the army in 5 minutes. More or less. My 5 minutes. No, I'll do it. Just some thoughts. First, what did the army do? The chief of staff made the following decision. He said, number one, the service of women in the military, in every position that they desire to serve, bracket, with the exception of units where there's life and death in most cases, is a core principle of the Israeli army. This is an army in which men and women are completely equal. We are an army which worked unbelievably hard to create a standard in which sexual harassment is removed. And everybody said, oh, that's going to be impossible. General after general after general gets kicked out. Kicked out. This is a place that women are going to be comfortable. Not only are they going to be comfortable, I want their voices. I want women to sing wherever women want to sing, because that's what it means to embrace the place of women in my army. No one, no matter what your feelings are, will have any impact on hindering the ability of women to sing. Rule number one. Clear. Valued. Do you remember what I'm saying? Principle. And then he says, and I have a second principle of our army. This is the army of all the Jewish people. And every single soldier is going to be comfortable in this army. And a notion that a soldier cannot feel comfortable in this army because of their religious beliefs violates what I want to do in this army. Two different religious principles. Instead of saying you care about religion, no, there are two counter ideologies at play. And when there's two counter ideologies at play, you can't have somebody winning. The only way you could do it is what? For those rabbis, what's the first Mishnah? Shnaim ochzim betali. Two people are holding on to the same garment. This one says, I found it. This one said, I found it. This one said, it's mine. This one said, it's all mine. The only solution is some compromise. And he therefore offers the following compromise. A, women are going to sing in every event and in every occurrence and in any instance that they choose that they want to sing. And if they're singing, I don't care if it's men or women, we're an army. When we sing, we're going to sing, and whoever's in our army is going to sing. When the event is an event of official status, such as Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, moments when it is critical for, now go back to the American case, critical for military cohesion. I can't have some soldier say, excuse me, I'm not going to this Memorial Day commemoration. When it's an official event, every soldier is going to show up, and any soldier who refuses to is going to be kicked out of the army. Unequivocal. This is an army of all of us, and when we have to do our military stuff, everybody's going to do it. However, when it is an event of a more entertainment dimension, while they also have value because unit cohesion is enhanced by celebrating and having entertainment with each other, however, here the harm to feelings will be greater. And any Israeli soldier who wants to can leave at that moment or not come. It's not that they're not going to sing, but if you don't want to be there at something of entertainment, that will be the compromise that I'm going to suggest. Very briefly, when it comes to buses, would it make a huge difference? Or couldn't we say, yes, I could understand very clearly that in a bus used by 99.9%, in a bus used by 90%, I could argue differently, because then there might be 10% who are severely harmed. In a bus in which almost everybody on that bus, or in fact everybody on that bus, just about, is Orthodox, the fact that it is a state-funded bus or not is not the point. Everything here is state-funded. Your right to create within our space an existence that you feel respects your values is something that I care about too. Why shouldn't I care that ultra-Orthodox can go on a bus in a way that they feel comfortable with? Would it make a critical difference, however, if women weren't in the back but they were in the front? When you put women in the back, you're violating a core fundamental principle which applies to all of my society. In my country, women aren't in the back. The meaning of being in a Jewish state is women aren't in the back. And it could be in another generation, the meaning of certain symbols might change, but in this generation it makes all the difference in the world. If you would say I'd separate the bus and women are in the front, would our sensibility be different? Would it have made a difference or not? I'm not asking you to agree with me, I'm asking you to think about it. I'm asking you to use the principles of the rights of the majority and the rights of the minority and a desire to create a space in which everybody feels respected, are relevant to all of us. And the ultra-Orthodox aren't them. They're us. Now, the fact that they don't necessarily see me as part of them might make it a little more difficult for me to stand by my principles. But at the end, the test of whether you stand by your principles is precisely at such a moment. I'm not looking for a pint of blood or equality. I'm looking to ask, what type of country do I want to have? And that country is made up of many, many different individuals. When it comes to drafting, here we all have to understand that we're talking about an issue which has nothing to do with equal service and military service. It is so deeper an issue about the essence of what it means to be a Jew in this modern world. This is not an issue that a majority could coerce a minority on. A majority has a right to say, I'm not going to fund it. A majority has a right to say, I'm not going to fund my own demise. That's your right. If one group believes that the future of Israel is dependent by a certain practice and the other by another, let there be a debate. Let the resources of the society reflect each group's perception of their rights and of their but the notion of punitive if you don't agree with me. It's perfectly legitimate for Israel to decide, just like as Netanyahu did. We have X number of slots for yeshiva students. We do. That's all we can afford. This has nothing to do with military service or non-military service. This has to do with what we as a society could fund. We economically cannot fund every single individual who wants to be in yeshiva or be in university or be whatever it may be. We as a society require the possibility of individuals entering into the job force. We as a society require that individuals have the knowledge and the capacity to assume responsibility for themselves. That I can't fund everything as a perfectly legitimate move in every society as it attempts to allocate its resources. But to force one group to acquiesce to your notion of Judaism is just not going to happen. We have here two groups whose feelings are going to be hurt. And therefore the wise person will not try to bring it to the head, but will rather let time pass. Do you know that thousands of ultra-Orthodox individuals today are serving in the army? And they didn't serve in the past? Something's happening. Let a life force continue. You don't win. In military terms, you know, and if somebody has a massive assembly of forces in one place, you don't need to, unless you're in Civil War military strategy, feel that your goal is to actually kill as much of each other as possible. Let's meet on the battlefield and fire away, and let's see who dies first. Usually the intelligent thing is to say, where do I want to get to? And if you're here, let me go to the left. Let me go to the right. Let me go around and reach my end. If our goal in Israeli society is to start shooting at each other and to see who wins, who suffers the most, and who could hold those casualties the best, I don't think that's the way you build a society. That's definitely not the way you build social cohesion. And it's not the way you build a Jewish democratic state. Part of our challenge, just like when we learn about people when we go back to Justice Brennan, First Amendment is not needed about small things. It's needed about big things too. It's needed about big things. As a wise people, we will know where there is room for a conversation and where the conversation is just about winning and spilling blood. Our challenge as a people is, now that we've returned to statehood, how do we live with each other? How do we recognize, as our tradition teaches us, that to scar the face of the Jewish people is a violation of Jewish law? And how do every single one of us take upon ourselves a responsibility, not to win, but to create a little bit greater love? Not to show that my ideology won, but to show that my ideology means that I want to live with you. Who knows what a little love will do? Who knows what a little consideration will do? Maybe you might actually find that those who were them are now a part of us. And that with a little gentleness and a little kindness, we're not going to lose, but that the Jewish people and the state of Israel will win. Thank you. We have some time for a few questions, please. And we'll conclude at 8:35. Yes, please.
I'm wondering if, based upon the decision of Torah from the Minister of Transportation, what was the decision last summer with the protests in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem right by the Jaffa Street?
See, Jaffa Street, great, is a different. There, the demonstrations were about parking in the Karta parking lot, which is not in the midst of an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, and therefore the Supreme Court consistently turns down the rights of the ultra-Orthodox, because there what they're trying to do is to define all of Jerusalem, not to define their neighborhood. There you don't have a right, and the harm to others is far greater. Any other questions, please? Yes, please, sis. I'll repeat the question.
Today we listened to a clergy. Thank you. Today we listened to an Episcopal clergy who, when asked how he felt about having an Israeli Arab, an Israeli Christian Arab, how he felt about Hatikva and being part of a Jewish state. And his response was that he worried about the feeling of not belonging, and it bothered him.
In my remarks, I took the easy road because I only dealt with a little small problem, and that is the problem between Jews. I didn't deal with that larger issue. And I'm going not to deal, because to answer it is going to require too much time, and that would be cruel and, what's it called again? Punishment. An unusual punishment. To give another lecture on the basis of a question. It is, however, I would say to you, Israeli society as a whole is not yet even ready to hear that question. And maybe it's a generation too early, but it doesn't mean that the question is not going to be asked. But right now, until the majority of Israelis don't feel that their sovereignty is not being questioned, when your sovereignty is taken for granted and the national minorities are experienced as seeing themselves as part of your national, as a minority within somebody else's sovereignty, not as a counter-sovereignty, then the issue will not be resolved. Now, that individual might be there, but much of the conversation on this issue is not there, but that's a whole other, I'm going to leave it at that. It's a huge issue that we're going to have to address eventually. Yes, please.
In the context of what you just said, as a follow-up, didn't recently they defended the right of the Supreme Court justice not to sing Hatikva, and that kind of contradicts, or at least collectively, the fact that there is some willingness to acknowledge.
No, there was a debate. Here it was. He didn't sit down. He stood up while Hatikva was being sung, but he didn't say the words. And it wasn't the Supreme Court, but there was actually a debate. Could somebody be on the Supreme Court and not sing those words? But we recognize that there is a problem here. Whether Israeli society will be willing to change Hatikva or not. That's what it's one thing to say you could be in and out. I actually see you as in and out, so it resonates. But whether we're going to create a new us with a majority, with a strong Jewish majority and a non-Jewish minority, that's an issue that we're not yet ready for that question. Yes, please. And then last two, and then we'll conclude. Yes.
I'm curious about the decision to base this great lecture on texts that are not of a religious nature, since you're dealing with Jewish issues.
You ask me, why would I use these sources?
Or why would you use secular sources instead of...
Now, for many reasons. Number one of our goals, or one of my goals, and this is also part of a new unit that we're working on, as part of Engaging Israel 2.0, which will be out before the end of 2012, is what are the types of informations that are conducive in order to enhance understanding and sensitivity. And on this issue, there are certain Jewish issues, and we can teach the laws of Lotid Godadu, but one of the critical issues about engaging Israel is that as long as individuals believe that the problem is in Israel, the problem is the fact that there's a Jewish state. The problem is with the electoral system. The problem is that you don't have a constitution. What it basically does is that you create a problem which creates a separation between North American Jews and Israelis. As long as you see, however, that we're all in this, every society, this is not a uniquely Israeli problem. And the ultra-Orthodox aren't some weirdos who are taking away Israel from you. But that it's a different conversation. It becomes a vehicle for engaging and embracing. And what we're doing is we're testing the use of these sources, your guinea pigs, whether these sources create a different level of understanding, and maybe Leviticus 19 is not that conducive for this exact issue. Might not be. Besides the fact that these sources are just so beautiful. Last question, and with that we'll conclude for tonight. Yes, please.
The actual practice in Israeli jurisprudence, does the weight afforded to feelings in matters such as this prevent rulings from actually becoming rulings? That is to say, does not the losing side not always retain the right to turn back to the court and say, actually, you miscalculated, in your feelings quotient.
Sure
Our
it
feelings
does.
were more passionate than theirs.
Sure it does. And part of the legal process in Israel is that the courts have to give a ruling on every request. There is no process. The prior Minister of Defense Minister of Justice tried to create a principle whereby courts could actually decide. Like, one of the interesting things about the American Supreme Court is what issues they even choose to address. In Israel, every issue must be addressed. Now you could reclaim and you could go over, and there's new circumstances. The discussion never ends, which is, maybe that's the ultimate expression of what it means to be a Jewish state. But because the issues are never completely closed down, and we know that as a society we haven't gotten it right yet. But my hope is that tonight was in some way a little helpful. I'm not asking you to agree about this or that. If what we could agree on is the type of sensitivity we want to bring to a question, maybe we can go a little further and develop that a Jewish society of greater kindness, which I hope will be an oxymoron. It was a pleasure. Thank you all very, very much.